The Hung's roster is filled with exactly the type of units you'd expect from their hunter-gatherer nature. You have many units focused on taking down larger threats with varied ranged power, lots of skirmishing, and plenty of monsters to keep things fun. Let's take a look and see how best to use them. And if you want to know how best to see these videos without ads, it's by becoming a channel member. All the same videos with none of the ads, and YouTube won't throttle your connection. Everybody wins, so now let's see which of these units does too. Starting of course with the Lords, and first we have the legendary Lord, Khan, and he's a bit of a strange character. On the one hand, he does great anti-infantry damage, especially versus low armor. Those excellent melee stats and high non-armor piercing damage allow him to shred anything weak you put in front of him. However, on the other hand, he also lacks any defense outside of just defense, so against ranged focus or even another good battler, he will quickly go down with only moderate armor. He also has some decent abilities to empower himself and allies and weaken enemies, making him a strong lord to have on the front lines, even if he ends up avoiding serious combat once you get to the later game. He can also choose to transform into a buffing machine with a range of powerful auras for his allies, at the cost of losing all of his offensive capabilities and taking constant damage. For his mounts, he has the Shogun. This gains him a lot more speed and charge bonus and allows him to really find his feet. With the flight, he is a lot more maneuverable and can pick his targets a lot easier. He can lead his cavalry in taking out enemy backlines, focus on non-melee lords or heroes, or simply go for the backs of the enemy front lines to help his troops. Next up we have Zhao Kor. This lad is a chunky frontlines tank with lots of damage and an ability to take it. He still has very strong melee stats for both attack and defense, allowing him to stay in the fight for a very long time. Whilst there, he'll rack up a ton of value with a nice chunk of armor piercing damage. Add on his abilities to drastically empower allies and weaken enemies, and he never wants to leave melee. For his mounts, he has Susan. This adds more speed and charge bonus, so he can now take his high damage and tankiness on tour. Still the same powerful melee combatant, only now a lot faster. It may be worth skipping if you want to keep him in the heat of battle, but is otherwise a good pick to allow him to choose his targets a lot easier. First of the generic lords is the Cartoon. These are pretty similar to Khan from the melee standpoint, with comparable damage but reduced melee stats, so end up a little weaker. However, they also have some medium range missile power with decent damage, albeit not the most armor piercing. They can enhance theirs and allies' missile power, as well as their own melee power and speed, so work best on the back lines, leading your missile troops and only engaging in melee when absolutely necessary. Both non-legendary lords also affect nearby allies' leadership based on how they're doing, so it's very important you keep them confident to avoid a chain route. For their mounts, they have the Nomad Horse. This offers more speed and charge bonus, but I'd still stick with the missile focus. They can now choose to stay on the back lines with troops or fall in with missile cav. As long as they're doing something with shooting missiles, they're golden. And they also have access to the Hung Cataphract. This loses a little speed but gains the Masterful Tactics, Dust Cloud, and Bandit Chieftain abilities. These grant various stat buffs alongside stealth for them and nearby allied units, making them great for sneaking for a flank. And we also have the Khan Lords. These are entirely melee focused, gaining more attack and weapon strength, but losing a little defense and speed. Similar to Khan, they want to get involved on the front lines, on whatever has the least armor, to make the most of that non-armor piercing damage. They have abilities to reduce enemy leadership and increase that of allies to keep them in line. They also have access to the Nomad Horse and the Hung Cataphract. For the heroes, we have the Katil. These are quite similar to the Katun, with decent non-armor piercing melee power, alongside decent non-armor piercing missile strength. They're good hybrid units with very high attack and poison damage, being just as viable as moderate range magical damage. As usual, I'd stick with the backlines for safety, but either works depending on what you're up against. And, as a bit of added stealth, they can use concealment bombs to give them time to hide and reposition. And they have access to a Nomad Horse. The Dagger are similar to the Khans, with a complete focus on melee, only less damage and more defense and armor. These are extremely tanky frontlines battlers with okay non-armor piercing damage. This lack of armor piercing damage and bonus versus large makes them strong versus weaker cav and monsters, but otherwise they're a great bulwark to bolster your front lines. They have abilities to increase the stats of nearby allies, mostly allowing them to hold a line for even longer. They have access to a Nomad Horse and a Hung Cataphract. And lastly, we have the Hung Shaman Heroes, and these can come with the Law of the Raging Sky, the Law of Beasts, or the Laws of Chaos. These are a bog standard straightforward spellcaster with no melee prowess outside of that. Going to keep things short and just say keep them out of melee and in a position to cast, and they should do fine. For laws, you have beasts and 1.5 new laws. The Laws of Chaos is just a mix of the 3 Laws of Chaos. You get some damage, buffs, and healing, so a great set of spells. And the Law of the Raging Sky is all new and unique to the Hung. The law is a mix of some truly devastating damage alongside buffs best used on cav, counter spells for enemy missiles, and some fun gambling for the caster themselves. Also, the passive replenishes ammo for all units, so not half bad. And for their mounts, they have the Nomad Horse, the Hung Cataphract, and for the Chaos caster, they swap this for the Chaos War Shrine. Coming now to the melee infantry, and first up we have captives. These are the weakest of the weak front lines and are more of a meat shield than anything with any real potential to do anything. No armor, pathetic melee stats and damage, and non-existent leadership mean they will likely run before enemies even get close. If you really need to make up some numbers, then go right ahead. Otherwise, they're honestly a little bit too weak to be worth it. Have them absorb the first barrage of missiles and clear a path for proper units, and they'll be getting their value. Plus, they come with the added bonus that when they're under missile fire, they increase the missile block chance of nearby units, so can offer some very minor protection to everything nearby. The Hung Nomads are the first proper melee infantry unit in the roster, and they're okay for one of the cheapest units. Okay melee stats and armor, alongside some fine damage for so early in the game. They likely won't win the battle alone, so giving them whatever support you can will for sure be the way to go. Similarly, they won't hold the line forever, especially if their opposition has any real damage, so giving them support is essential. Lastly, they and almost every other unit in the roster have the Unwashed Faith passive. This grants spell resistance as long as they're not wavering, making magic a little less effective. The Great Weapons Hung Pillagers are essentially your high damage for the early game front line. They drop half the armor from Nomads along with a good chunk of defense. In exchange, they gain a substantial boost to attack along with a bunch of armor-piercing weapon strength. All of this combined with their frenzy makes them extremely strong damage dealers, especially when they're feeling confident. However, that damage comes at a cost of pretty pitiful defense. In melee, they're pretty easy to hit, but from a range, they go down in no time. A lack of shields and armor makes them incredibly easy to pick apart, so be sure to focus enemy ranged units before they get a chance to give these guys the best chance possible in melee. We also have Dual Weapons Hung Pillagers. These drop a bunch of armor piercing to gain a little bit more attack and a bonus versus infantry. They are better versus less armored infantry, but other than that, tend to fall off a lot faster since they share the same lack of defense. If you know what you're going up against and it's a bunch of chaffy units, then by all means, give them a go. Otherwise, the Great Weapons are probably my choice, since they'll be more useful in more situations for more time. The Dog Handlers are a pretty small entity count unit, but share the same armor, leadership and speed as the Pillagers. They drop quite a lot of attack from dual weapons, but gain just as much defense, making them more defense oriented in melee. They're more here to hold the line and reduce enemy leadership with their discouraging attacks, so be sure to provide them as much support as you can. Their real damage comes from their ability to summon hunting dogs. These are a smaller unit size than Chaos Warhounds, but come with a little bit more bite. They see stat improvements to almost everything, giving them some pretty strong attack and damage, but not that much defense. They can still be used the same, but their bonus versus large means weak cav-like skirmishers are also good targets. Still, 2-for-1 deal, that isn't too bad. And lastly, the Hung Spawn Eaters. Back to a more standard entity count, and we're keeping the low armor, but seeing a nice increase to almost everything that matters. Compared to dual weapons, they gain a nice increase to attack and defense, making them a strong all-round melee battler. Combined with their decent armor-piercing damage and anti-large, they can take on most threats and still put up a good fight. Still, compared to other endgame infantry, they are a little bit weak, so will need support as you get into the endgame. They do have their nets to pin down enemies and reduce defense to turn the tide a little bit more in their favour. Plus, you can never complain about regen to help them stay alive just a little bit longer. For the ranged infantry, first up we have Hung Scouts. Their melee power is about the same as melee nomads, so if push comes to shove, they can technically defend themselves okay, but staying back and attacking from a range is obviously preferred. The missile power is pretty low on armor piercing, but against most early game threats, they'll do just great. Especially against larger threats like single entities, this damage stacks up fast, so don't underestimate them. Use their firing arc to shoot over the heads of front lines, and focus on key targets in the enemy army, keeping out for incoming flanks to keep them out of harm's way and firing for as long as possible, and they'll do just fine. Most ranged units in the roster can also make use of various ammo types via research, and to save time I'll explain each type once and how it differs from the regular kind, and then just mention it if the others have them. So for Hung Scouts, they can get access to fire arrows, which offer a slight increase to non-armor piercing damage, alongside flaming and flammable imbued attacks. Next up, Step Trackers. On the melee side of things, they're a lot more focused on offense with decent attack and non-armor piercing damage, but of course we want to focus on ranged. They drop half the range of scouts along with a good chunk of armor, but gain a significant amount of armor piercing damage. They can shred through most targets with ease no matter what stage of the game, especially with their shield breaker, weakening enemy range defenses. However, all of this comes with the risk that their shorter range brings. They can fire over enemy heads, but to get damage off consistently and safely, they'll need to get on the flanks, which leaves them a lot more at risk of being caught out. That, or just use their Vanguard and Stalk to set up a sneak attack and pray they don't get caught. If you can manage that risk, then they're a great pick. The dismounted heavy archers are a lot more similar to scouts with the same range, but increases to almost every other stat. They're a lot tankier with very high armor, but still not much melee power. At a range, they see very minor increases to damage and ammo, but funnily enough, don't gain any armor piercing. They still have a slightly faster fire rate, but aside from that, the damage is pretty similar. Still, they're tougher and a little better, so use them just the same as scouts and now enjoy a tiny bit more damage. And they can make use of Scattershaft and heavy arrows. Scattershaft now launches more projectiles per volley with less damage per projectile but more overall damage, so is useful for large blobs of less armoured infantry. Heavy arrows have a reduced range, but heavily increased armor piercing damage, along with a bonus versus large. Dismounted Horsemasters are a similar story to heavy archers, but take it another step further. They now gain a shield and some decent armor piercing melee damage, making them stronger than most melee infantry units in the roster. Their missile power is similar to heavy archers, but again, no more armor piercing and just a slightly faster fire rate. This combined with their slightly longer range makes them better, but not massively so again, they can be more or less used the same from range, focusing on less armored targets, which will be a lot less common as the game goes on. Don't be afraid to get them into melee if they get flanked, as they'll defend themselves just fine and likely take a few enemies with them. They can make use of heavy, flaming, and whistling arrows. Whistling arrows have an increased range but reduced damage, along with some leadership sapping. And lastly, the Kvetul. These have the exact same missile stats as the Horsemasters, so the only change is to melee. They lose a tiny bit of defense along with their shields to gain a hefty chunk of attack and weapon strength. They also have an anti-infantry bonus rather than the anti-large, so do great versus enemy infantry. Honestly, between these and the Horsemasters, I don't think dedicated melee infantry are necessary, so feel free to use these as a front line with some ranged poke, as they really do it best. They can make use of heavy, poison, and explosive arrows. Poison drops the damage to add poison to reduce enemy stats, and explosive arrows deal considerably more armor-piercing damage, along with dealing it in an area for the titular explosions. Now we come to the Cavalry and Chariots. First up, the Light Lancers, and as early cav units go, these are actually pretty damn strong. They may not have the most armor or weapon strength, however their decent melee stats, strong charge and excellent speed make them devastating shock cavalry for taking on lower armor early game infantry. Backlines and the backs of the front lines alike will feel the burn from their charges, making them a real powerhouse for any early battles. Once they're up against armor, they will start to drop off, but early on, they will be fantastic. Use their vanguard to set up ambushes or just abuse their speed to get wherever you need them. Hung Raiders drop a little bit of damage and charge bonus to gain shields and some slight boost to melee stats. This makes them a tiny bit worse at cycle charging and a tiny bit better at sustained melee. If you're not confident you can stay on top of the micro enough for the Lancers, then these are a good choice, as they're a little bit more forgiving when left in combat. Still, stick to backlines if you're leaving them, as proper melee units will still take them down pretty quick. Next, Hung Ambushers. From a quick glance at their stat card, they seem like a downgrade for both units so far, but with one attribute, they're actually a nice little improvement. Devastating Flanker doubles their charge bonus when attacking enemies in the rear, so as long as you do that, you are gaining 10 charge bonus from Lancers, along with the rest of the stat changes on the card. They drop quite a lot of defense and armor, making them entirely reliant on charge to both deal damage and survive. They see a nice increase to leadership, attack, and weapon strength, increasing their damage output, especially when charging. You want to keep them on the move and charging at all times and avoid sustained melee at all costs, as they simply cannot survive. With Vanguard and Woodsman, they can attack from anywhere, especially with their high speed, so aim for some backs and they'll rack up kills in no time. Heavy Lancers compared to Light Lancers are about what you'd expect. Significant improvements to every stat but speed, which sees a small decrease. They're tankier, more confident, better at both charging and sustained melee, and are still plenty fast, so it's a great trade-off. Whilst they can keep themselves alive and deal good damage in sustained melee, the way to go it, of course, is cycle charging to make the most of that extremely high charge bonus. Especially if you make use of their lance formation, they hit like a truck, just be sure to turn it off when they get bogged down, both to improve their melee stats and to help them escape if needed. The Torgud are a little bit of a lateral move from Lancers and are really for a very specific purpose. They drop a little bit of each melee stat and some charge bonus to gain leadership, weapon strength, and bonus versus large. They also swap the Lance formation for the Flying Wedge, granting them even more bonus versus large without affecting melee stats. They're an anti-large specialist cavs who want to focus on anything large on the enemy force. Whether that means other cav or giant single entities, you want to target them, preferably with cycle charging, but melee works too, depending on what they're going up against. Just be wary of their low defense and keep them on the move if it gets too hot. Lastly, we have one more shock cavalry unit. Coming from the Heavy Lancers, it's just minor improvements across the board. Tons of armor, great melee stats, and fantastic charge bonus makes them a top of the line shock cav with the ability to throw down in sustained melee if they really have to. With charge bonus this high, you are absolutely leaving value on the table if you do this, but it is possible if you really can handle the micro. Plus, they have glorious charge, so they're even better at sapping enemy leadership and HP, so make sure you're at least charging to make your first impact, and make whatever follows a lot easier. Lastly, they also have the Guardian ability, which will make nearby lords and heroes a little bit tougher. Kicking off the Missile Cavalry, we have the Hung Horse Archers. They're actually remarkably similar to the Light Lancers, but drop quite a large chunk of charge bonus. They can still do okay in melee, but of course ranged is the safest bet and best use of their time. They have a medium range and deal essentially the same damage as Scouts, so nothing crazy, but can add up fast if you focus fire. Get them behind enemy lines and stick them on skirmish for essentially free value, especially with how fast they can move. If you want to give them a slight boost to damage and don't mind them being stuck in one place, you can always use their circle and shoot formation to increase their fire rate and missile resistance at a small vigor cost. Otherwise, they're a decent early skirmish unit, so use them wisely. and they can make use of whistling and poison arrows. The hung heavy archers drop a little bit of speed to gain improvements to basically every other stat. Their melee power is okay and they're passable early game flankers, but of course the way to use them is to make the most of that range damage. Would you believe me if I told them they have the same missile strength as the dismounted heavy archers with just a little bit less range and ammo? That means not a ton of armor piercing, but they're still great for getting on the flanks and firing on key targets to whittle them down in no time. They still have that circle and shoot if you want some extra fire rate, so you can really use them just the same as the regular horse archers. And they can make use of scattershaft and heavy arrows. The hung horse masters see improvements across the board from heavy archers, but once again can be used exactly the same. Still not a massive amount of armor piercing, so will do decent damage, but it drops off against tougher targets, so be sure to pick something soft. They can make use of heavy, whistling, and fire arrows. And lastly, the mounted shamans of Char. These are probably the worst in melee of all the missile cav, but at least they bring something unique to the missile department. They may not be able to fire on the move, but their missiles are extremely high damage with magical, fire, and warp flame. The armor piercing is not the greatest, but even so, they can punch through most defenses with relative ease. However, with only 10 ammo, you may think they burn bright and burn out fast, and that's where their abilities come in. They can adopt the channeling stance, which prevents them from moving but increases their range by up to double, depending on how many spells are cast on either side of the battle. This allows them to become artillery units, especially with their curved firing arc, allowing them to easily fire over the heads of nearby allies. Secondly, their latent magic ability constantly replenishes their ammo whenever they're stood still, which of course channeling forces them to do. It's not quite enough to replenish ammo faster than they can use it, but if you simply set them up and keep them still, they will keep firing, however slowly, all battle long. They're a great addition to any army and the only real artillery option the faction has. Now for the monsters and beasts. First up, Chaos Warhounds. These are just the same as the Chaos unit, so no need to go over them here, and the same goes for the Poison Chaos Warhounds. The Feral Horse Herd are a much smaller entity count than Warhounds, but otherwise an improvement across the board, with one small caveat I'll come to in a sec. They're extremely fast and have a ton of mass. This combined with their moderate charge bonus makes them a devastating shock cav monster unit, best used for cycle charging. Their attack and defense aren't the best, so keeping them on the move allows them to deal damage and stay alive a whole lot easier. That said, their trampled imbued attacks reduces the defenses and speed of all units hit, making them easier to take down for anything else in the area. However, the major downside is their feral rage, meaning they are prone to going on a rampage, so really try to keep them healthy, as rampage is almost guaranteed to be a death sentence. The closest unit to Chaos Vultures, stat-wise, is the Carrion from the Tomb Kings, but I promise it is still a vast improvement over that. The entity count is a lot smaller, and that results in a lot more power per bird. Their attack sees a nice increase at the cost of their defense, but these really are backline harassment units, so that's not too much of a problem. Their damage is some of the best armor piercing in the roster so far, so they will cut through backlines with ease. With their high speed and vanguard deployment, nothing can escape them for long, as long as you use some creative flight paths to avoid missile fire. They can also do great on the backs of the front lines or really against anything, just be sure to pull them out before they get bogged down, as they really can't survive too long against anything with real melee power. And as a last cherry on top, their Raptorial Instinct ability grants them more attack and charge, whilst charging for a little bit of added damage on impact. The Chaos Spawn is just the same as the Chaos unit. Next up, the Steppe Centaur Herd. These drop a little bit of speed from the Horse Herd along with some weapon strength. However, they gain shields, armor, and charge bonus along with a lot more entities, and of course, Primal Fury. This all results in a unit that is excellent for charging into backlines or the backs of the front lines with hefty impact and high speed. I'd avoid prolonged melee against anything that can really fight, as their defense is still pretty weak, but if you use them like shock cavalry, they should do pretty great. We also have great weapons, Steppe's Centaur Herds. These drop some defense for a little bit more attack and armor piercing damage. Since they should focus on cycle charging anyway, these are the obvious pick for more damage, as the defense shouldn't even be used if you're playing them correctly. The Great Bow Steppe Centaur Herd are about on par with the regular herd for melee power, but drastically drop the entity count and gain some range damage. They have great range and strong armor piercing damage, making them a good pick for sniping down high value targets like large or even giant monsters. Their limited ammo and entity count mean infantry can be a waste of time, since no explosive power means they're going to burn a lot of ammo on a single unit with a bunch of entities. Still, if you focus fire on the units that really matter, they can do some great damage, and afterwards, you still have some half decent backlines charges. The Centaur Elder is another hybrid weapon Centaur unit, but this one is a single entity. Coming from the Great Bows, it is a little bit slower, but much more powerful in melee, though not the most armor piercing. From range, it drops a lot of range and ammo, but gains a massive amount of missile strength, including a little explosive power, but not the most armor piercing. This can do some great damage to whatever it hits by aiming, but it really is up to the unit itself, since you can only use melee attack when moving it around. See the range damage as a little soften up before landing in melee, and focus on cycle charging so it has plenty of opportunities to use it. Don't be fooled by the limited ammo, as whenever it's in melee, it will replenish ammo and heal to keep it in peak fighting form. It's a bit of an odd unit, but can do some great damage if you keep it moving and pick less armored targets. And lastly, we have the Death Worm. Aside from its colossal size, it is a total melee powerhouse. It has absurdly high armor alongside pretty respectable defense and 2 types of resistance, meaning not much can touch this thing outside of a lot of focused fire from a range. It also deals massive damage with very high attack, excellent armor piercing weapon strength, and even some decent charge bonus. If all that wasn't enough, it also drops the armor of nearby enemies, making them even easier to take out. As with anything this size, you want to make sure it doesn't get totally surrounded or picked apart from a range, but as long as you can manage those 2 things, it is a melee powerhouse that can rack up a massive amount of value. We also have a number of units from the adaptive Warlords mechanic that was covered in the campaign video. From the Land of Chill, we have Harpies from the Dark Elves, Sea Dragon Hunters, which are Black Art Corsairs. They swap Murderous Prowess for Unwashed Faith, which of course grants them spell resistance. Demonettes of Slaanesh are the Slaanesh units, the Hung Reaper Bolt Throwers are the Dark Elves units, and they get the same passive swap as the Black Art Corsairs. And the same story for the Hung Scourge Runner, which is of course another Dark Elf unit. And lastly, the Tortured Hydra, which is another Dark Elf unit. This drops to regen and health a little bit to gain the Chaos Brands passive for more physical and spell resistance, with the small downside of a risk of rampage. From the Chaotic allies, they have the Shielded Gore Herd from the Beastmen, the Marauder Berserkers from Norska, the Halberds Chaos Warriors from Chaos, the Minotaurs from the Beastmen, the Magma Cannon from the Chaos Dwarves. This gains the Hellbound passive to grant magical attack, physical resistance, and perfect vigor, and the Dragon Ogre Shaggoth from Chaos. And lastly, the Far East. The Steel Spitters are Iron Hail Gunners from Cathay. They gain a small amount of weapon strength and swap Harmony for Unwashed Faith. The Looted Cannons are the Grand Cannons from Cathay, and they gain the same passive as the Steel Spitters. Riders of the Raging Sky are Great Longma Riders from Cathay, and they have the same passive swap and can now hide in forests. The Thunder Spitter is a Fire Rain Rocket Battery and has the same passive swap. The Wall Ripper is an Iron Blast unit from the Ogres and gets the same passive but loses the Wounds passive, which is technically a small buff. And the Dread Beasts of Morn are multiple Stonehorn Harpoon launchers. There's 5 of them, so you gain a lot of health and ammo at the cost of some small melee stats and some rather large ranged ones. Now much more focused on melee with quite low missile power, and lastly, they swap wounds for Chaos Brands. For the Regiments of Renown, they have Nafatun, which are Hung Nomads. They gain some limited ammo ranged weapons. The Agyar Carrion Eaters are Hung Spawn Eaters. They now also heal whenever nearby allied entities die. Onagal's Hunters are dismounted heavy archers. They now have the Cloud of Flies and Mark of Onagal passives, which increases their melee defense and healing when attacked. The Night Guard are Kvetul. They gain the Night Guard, Death Blow and Guardian passives to reveal nearby enemies, deal more melee damage at low health, and defend nearby lords and heroes. The Blood Rage Riders are Hung Raiders, and they gain the Blood Rage and Mark of Korgar passives for more attack, resistance, and damage buffs. The Sky Hunters are Hung Ambushers. They can now fly, cause terror, and gain frenzy for more damage at high leadership. The Day Guard are Torgud. Not only are they masters of the Night Guard, they gain dazzling armor and guardian to weaken enemies and defend their lords. The Khan's Shield are Khan's Guards. They gain access to the Flying Wedge formation along with the Thunderous Charge and Indomitable passives for more powerful charging and various buffs when losing in melee. The Shaman Fire Singers are mounted Shamans of Char. They gain access to Pink Fire of Sinch and Infernal Gateway spells alongside missiles similar to the Flames of Sinch, with a much shallower firing arc, so flanking is a lot more preferable. The Ghosts of Burag are a feral horse herd. They can no longer rampage and gain the Chilling Aura alongside Strider, Unbreakable, and Undead to slow enemies and move faster. The Great Herald are Chaos Vultures. It is a single entity, so a lot more powerful, but there's just one of them. It also gains the Tune to Magic and Herald of War passives to become empowered at high winds of magic, and sow chaos on the battlefield. The Windmane Acolytes are the Centaur Great Bows. They gain some ward save and magical monstrous impact missiles. And lastly, the Great Korkoi is a Death Worm, and this gains the Thunderous Presence passive for bombardment damage. Now for a little bit of a mod review of the roster. I'm not gonna lie, initially I wasn't feeling too hot on this roster since I was wondering where all the armor piercing damage would come from, since outside of a few monsters and elite units, they were a little bit lacking. Well, the joke's on me because they have something that I was saying should have been in the game for a while now. Upon completing certain research projects, you unlock those different missile units for your ranged troops, allowing cheap and seemingly weak units to really rake in the value. Honestly, go to decision, and like I said, I wish stuff like this was in the base game, as it makes the tech tree a lot more impactful. Anyway, that mild blunder on my part aside, the roster is very on brand for what little I know of the Hung. They're a marauding hunter-gatherer people, so it makes sense that they have a large number of units based on hunters and pillagers. They have a heavy focus on cavalry and missile units, which is pretty reminiscent of something like the Mongols, at least to my desperately uneducated brain. Alongside this, you have a number of powerful monsters and fun magical units to keep things interesting. And as if all of that wasn't enough, you have 1.5 new Laws of Magic, and the Laws of Chaos is something I wish other factions had access to, just for a bit of fun. I will say that their roster does require you to really lean into their playstyle to survive. If you don't like cycle charging and skirmishing and kiting enemies, then you are probably going to hate this roster, as it will barely function if you try and use it as a simple line holder backlines army. However, if you do lean into that playstyle, this can be extremely powerful and a lot of fun. In my opinion, I really do like that it forces you into a certain playstyle rather than making them kinda good at everything. If I wanted to play the white bread of battle strategies, I'd play Kislev, thank you very much. All in all, lumping this and the campaign side of things together, it is a great mod that I highly recommend. It's a truly unique playstyle for every aspect of the game, and makes no compromises to make things more approachable. To some people that will be a turn-off, but if you simply lean into it, I really think you'll have a lot of fun. But what I want to know now is, what's your favourite unit from the roster? Are you a big fan of the Deathworm, or are you more about those Kvetul and their missile options? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video if you did, subscribe for more, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then check out this one all about the Hung in the campaign.